And thank you to the entire Asia Society team for curating this absolutely wonderful array of panelists. These artists are incredible, and it's a very challenging job as a moderator for me to try and do justice to all that they have to contribute to this conversation. So I would like to get started, but not without first thanking all of you for being here and listening to us this evening. So broadly, we have about an hour and something together this evening for this conversation, and I'm going to structure this conversation broadly in about 3 to 4 parts. We're going to start with some general questions, which I'll put to all of the panelists, and then some specific questions about their work. Like Ketaki said, feel free to keep sending in your questions. I'll be looking at them and I will try and weave them in. And if not, then we will definitely have time towards the end to address your questions. So with that, welcome all of you. And I think the first question when this panel was proposed to me, I found myself thinking of a similar conversation that I had with Christina Lamb, who reports from conflict zones and is clearly one of the greatest journalists of our times. I've been a huge fan, so it was a real opportunity to sit down and talk with her for a literature festival. And a large part of our conversation was really about how women's perspectives and women's reportage has been missing across wars, across conflicts, across fault lines. And it's mostly men telling the story of what, largely men control as well. And to me, this is an extension of that conversation, because one way to talk about conflict and fault lines is, straightaway reportage. But another way to talk about it is through memoirs, through personal histories, through art and theater and poetry and film, which is what all of you do in many ways. So I wanted to begin by asking a sort of very broad question, which is that what do you make of the absence of women's stories, women's perspectives from the history of divisions, conflict, strife across our worlds? And how are we the poorer for it? What is it that's missing when these stories are missing? What do they have the power to do, and why should we be prioritizing them? We can start with anybody, but perhaps we'll go in alphabetical order. At some point, I will confuse alphabetical order, but I think Anomaa is pretty straightforward, so we'll start with you, Anomaa.
The missing stories, when we look at conflict or any other history, I think one of the things is like the whole hierarchy within the family structures of the society, where that who answers what kind of. Because, for example, we know, all the time that we see that parents answering on behalf of children, teachers and other decision makers answering on behalf of others. So that even women on behalf of women all the time, someone else, a family member, a father, like men answering on behalf of women, we see things missing. But on the other hand, because of cultural taboos, there's a lot of screens where that women are behind. And on the other hand, do women open up to men? Who is holding the microphone? Who is holding the camera kind of question when it comes to that? Who is behind that? Do women open up? Can you open up about, especially we are talking about conflict, do we open up about your own personal experiences, abuse, whatever, to a person unknown, especially across the gender barriers? That is the question from, as a filmmaker, I have seen.
Absolutely. And Farah, coming to you, I mean, this is a more broad question, and I will in a minute also talk about your work specifically and what that in particular adds to how we understand Kashmir. But overall, if you had to answer this question, not just from the perspective of Kashmir, but overall, I would love to hear your, all your thoughts on what is missing from how we talk about.
I wouldn't necessarily say, Pragya, the women's point of view or perspective is missing. It gets delayed because conflict, wars, globally, apartheid, whether it's Palestinian voices, whether it's brutal colonization of Egypt, whether it's, you have Suad Amiri from Palestine, you have Nawal Sadvi, you have Nadine Gordimer, you have, Isabel Hamad recently from the Palestinian writer who wrote Enter Ghost. So there is a delay the way women process it, because women are always, I've been thinking about this term quite a bit lately. Whenever you report about war, I've been thinking about the headlines, etc. The way news is reported, women are sort of infantilized and clubbed with children. So women and kids were killed, like women and children were killed as well, like as if they're not agentic at all. And I've seen a lot of decisions in wars, conflicts by women, the small decisions on a daily basis, they then become the big decisions taken in households. There's war, there's drama out of this. But, it's also the Russian writer Svetlana Alexievich. She talks about, in her book, Unwomanly Face of War, she talks about how there's moral courage that is displayed and the moral heroism that's displayed by women. So I would say delayed reaction. It also takes you a while because of all the conditioning throughout the years and centuries that women won't understand, and they are the weaker ones in the war. But it's really, you face the war exactly the same way that a man does. And it's also, while she's clubbed with kids and children, but she's also aware of how her body can be weaponized against the whole community. She's a weapon. I have a chapter in later in the book, which talks about, there's a chapter which says, may I become invisible, please? And I think that's where you start realizing how your body can become a threat to your own community, to you. So there is this there's this conflict in your mind. I'm not as helpless, and I can be used, in powerful ways.
Absolutely, no, and that is again because I started talking about Christina Lamb, and that's the book, in fact, that we were talking about. Our bodies, their battlefields, and this is just something so mind-boggling because from before the medieval period, from early history to now, across eras, this is one thing that remains common: the weaponizing of women's bodies for conflict. But coming to you, thoughts.
Unmute myself. Yes. What I experienced that, as Farah said, that yes, we do hear women's voices, but it is very delayed. But at the same time, what I experienced that we couldn't, as a society, we couldn't give them a safe space to talk about it. When I think about Bangladesh's history, we saw that how women couldn't talk about it because even in Bangladesh's case, we say that at least 70% women were taken back to the society and their their homes, who were violated and who were raped in the war, but they were taken back as long as they don't talk about it. And that is what I mean. I mean that we need to give survivors, we need to give women and men who had gone through or who are going through a war that safe space to talk about what actually happened to them. Because when it comes to women, it is not only what happened to them in terms of trauma. It also 1,000 years of guilt, because I want to tell some one kind of saying of Birangana sister. She told me that when a man rapes another woman, that woman's generations goes to heaven. That woman's generations go to heaven. And we don't talk about the perpetrator most of the time. They don't even come to the come to the conversation. So that is the kind burden we have on women's, and also we need to remember, when a war ends, that war ends for the survivors. That a war can go on for generations to come. So it doesn't end for her or her family or her community. And when a woman is responsible to keep the shame of a family and a community, and that woman, when she fails to kind of carry that responsibility, then the society blames that woman. That's how we see. That's how we see that we often blame the victim of sexual violence, and the perpetrator, we don't even talk about the perpetrator. So this is kind of consequences of our mindset that has been there for the dawn of time. So to give, I think the most important for us, so that survivors can come out and talk what happened to them, if we can give them a safe space, and if we can ensure this safe space to them. Because I just would like to say just one incident, what happened in the Netherlands when one of our survivors joined, and she was. We used to have that music session, and she was singing, and all of a sudden she burst out, and she started dancing. And I was so amazed to see that woman who never spoke, like very, very soft-spoken woman, she's doing that. It means that when a person is given that safe space, you can see their true self.
You brought up birangunas, and you brought up trauma and how it affects, goes down generations. And I hope to bring both these things back to you in a bit and discuss them more. But Ruby, your thoughts on this larger question?
Yeah, I feel that historically around the world, women's narrative is missing in the mainstream. Either it's erased, it's hidden, or overlooked. I think I understand why great women artists turn their backs to the world, because either they have to survive and make work, or they strive for visibility. So they have been kind of in the blind spot of history, because I feel this is important, and it is when you are stripped off from your possessions, from your home, or you live in a trauma for years, or how can someone else tell your story, or how can someone else can speak that the truth? And I think nobody can. I believe that there is a lot of work to be done to bring these things on the surface, because if a woman is in survival of a war or something, how would other people know what she went through? I read the other day biography of a soldier who wrote that when they were invading Algeria, they were surprised to see and were embarrassed that women would suddenly run to the barns to go and get some cow dung or urine put on their bodies to protect themselves. And this was shocking to them. So, this is a very little thing that I guess that these voices can never kind of surface until and unless the person who experience it is given the chance to come forward or, to express.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you for that, Ruby. Varunika.
I also think that women's experiences are often trivialized and marginalized, especially women's articulation of politics, because politics is considered a very male domain. It's the domain of a male intellectual. And that itself is a very problematic concept. We saw this in Shaheen Bagh, in the farmers' movement. I agree with Farah, women's experiences are often infantilized, and it's always I think this came up in the context of farmers' movement, why are women and children being kept here, almost as if women do not have any political agency of their own, or they do not understand what they are experiencing, or they do not have the capacity to articulate it for themselves, and hence it has to be articulated through a male agent. And you see this in progressive spaces as well. I've been through 2 universities in India where I've attended Women's Day marches where men have tried to outshout women in shouting patriarchy down, down. Even in the arts, you see this, from your peers, they expect something of a very deep, authentic experience, or what they consider as a woman's authentic experience, which is something to do with some kind of imagined inner life that a woman has. So the moment you talk about politics or you they're like, but what about you? Where is you in this? And then you say hey, being a woman in South Asia is an extremely political thing. How this is who I am. What is this authentic inner world that I am supposed to express? So yeah, I think this is also something that we really need to think. And I think one of the ways we can think about it is to have conversations like this and to build solidarities where we kind of very strongly say that women's voices, we cannot keep shutting them out, and women's experiences are different and varied.
No, I think that's that's Varunika. The one thing you brought up is has always amazed me, that even when women are given the space or allowed the voice to talk, there's always a sense of what a woman should be about, which is kind of women's stories. And while a lot of us are often interested in telling that story, it's for centuries of men have told our stories, or why can't we tell the story of men, of other genders, of animals, of the world, of art? Perhaps it'll be a different story without then necessarily being, you just tell us what the women's point of view is. So that's quite interesting. And perhaps we'll come back to this to kind of try and unpack this. But before I do that, Farah made a wonderful point about the infantilization of women, and by saying, in conflicts, the women and children dead. So, I mean, it's not just in war in India particularly, and I don't know how it is in other South Asian countries, but in India, even our government, even our ministry is a women's and child development ministry. That clubbing together is transcends conflict and transcends death and accident, right? And the same way, perhaps we could be tempted, because we have such 5 amazing women sitting and talking to me here, to club South Asia as sort of one identity group that is conversing. And we have somebody from India, from Kashmir, from Bangladesh, from Pakistan, from Sri Lanka, and in that sense, it's quite an incredible panel. And we have so much shared history. And yet there's also a very fragmented understanding of conflict. What's partition for one country is not for another. It's a very, very, even when I say the word partition, all of us will relate to it very differently. All of you will relate to it very differently, the 2 Indians, by the into Varunika and me being here. But So I was just wondering if that's something that you would like to quickly come in on, lest people start thinking that this is a very homogenous group having, who clearly would have this, the same understanding of history and conflict. We could start with you, Anomaa, since we're doing this in a
Yes, I actually talking about borders and boundaries, in relation to partition, because Sri Lanka being an island and into a war and a conflict which lasted 30 years. And there were times like conflict based on ethnicity, and then which developed into an armed struggle and a war. And even like understanding of these borders, because during if I recall, like during war or during no war, no peace times, because we have had a lot of peace talks, and during that time, even like that the reference to borders within the country, like because that we had whose zone that we are in, kind of like border villages. There were 8 districts in Sri Lanka, like because the conflict was between the LTT and the others. There were like kind of a border, and those were called the border villages. Even in the discourse, like the reference to village in the war zone, like a bordering village, the border, which actually raised many issues, because that some used to say that border means that the border village means that there's a border, so that who's controlling what, even though that we know, like for a very long time during the conflict, like we had LTT controlling 2.5 administrative districts of Sri Lanka. All that, like for me, the borders, the partition, everything comes of this ethnic borders that we talk about, your identity, and then like the physical borders. So that growing up, like for me, the whole 30 years war and conflict was about the separation between two, and then with the ending of the war, like that whole concept, the questioning concept. So that's my understanding of like, war within the country, in the island.
I'm not going to put the question to all of you. If you would like to come in on this, only because time is short. So, but of course, if you would like to come in on this, I'd be very happy to hear your thoughts. So any of you want to add to what Anomaa was saying would be great. Or you can also revisit the question later. Anyone? Farah, Leesa, Ruby, Varunika?
I just want to make one point here. That is like while I was growing up in Bangladesh, the partition was not that much talked about, because when Pakistan came to be in 1947, right after that, around 1948, 1949, language movement started in East Pakistan, and then that follows, and then 71 happened. The magnitude, the ferocity of 1971 is so much in the memory that partition is not talked about that much. Only recently people are talking about it. We are losing people of that time. They started to kind of revisit that time, but because of the 71, when we talk about our struggle, it always refers to 1971 for us.
No, absolutely. And we can come back because I think it's a broader question to this via another subject. But moving on to more specifically your works, Farah, I'd like to start with you perhaps. When your memoir came out, it was really one of a kind because we have some wonderful books that have been written on the contemporary modern conflict in Kashmir, history of Kashmir, some memoirs, some great fiction that's come out of it. To my mind, there isn't enough, documentation and telling of Kashmir's own story through the point of view of those who have lived there, who have been living there. But from the point of a memoir from a woman, I mean, that's a rare beast. What is it that you set out to do with that memoir? And just to complicate that question a bit, one of the things that we fail to probably ask is what happens to women's movements when you're dealing with a larger sense of oppression, when you're dealing with a larger conflict. How do you keep patriarchy doesn't go away? In fact, conflicts are in many ways manifestations of one kind of patriarchy, but then there are other sort of more homegrown challenges. How do you keep the battle alive on many fronts? So yeah, it's a large question, but I'm sure you can take it.
Sure. Well, to the first part of the question, when I was actually writing about Kashmir, and everyone's writing a book in Kashmir, that's the joke. But I would have a lot of people tell me, men especially, everything has been written about Kashmir. What's the new thing that you're going to write? And I would just stare at them, musing, where is the woman's perspective? When you think, do you mean the documentation of what happened to men and what happened on the streets? And of course, horrible things happened. But what about girls and how they lived and the kind of fear that they lived with? So when I started writing the book, I was working with Reuters, and I realized I didn't want to write about Kashmir. I wanted to write as a Kashmiri woman specifically. And it took me a lot of time. I used to have panic attacks in sleep while I was going back and winnowing all the memories. But in the memoir, I think it's a limiting word in the sense that there are only 9 chapters about me out of 36, where it's basically a portrait of, I'm trying to recover time. The home that one had at that point doesn't exist anymore. It's that I'm trying to recover a time through that, through that memoir. There are 14 chapters about other women and girls who could cope or not cope with war. One killed herself by suicide, and somebody else would do something else. My aunt, whose son was killed, she used to go to his grave at night and try to dig him up. I would indulge in self-harm. So it was basically to show just how women's lives and how their experiences are so unique. And just because the book is sort of structured around my grandmother's funeral, but you see all the women, their stories. And then there was third aspect, which deeply disturbed me while growing up and unmoored me, still does, was losing landmarks. So earlier it used to be, my friend lives next to that big chinar tree, or a regular landmark, which became, or turn left from the small bunker, you'll get to the big bunker, then there's an army camp, drive after that, you remember where the firing happened. So suddenly the landmarks changed, and it became a world overnight changed, and it became extremely difficult to explain what had happened outside in the world, to our world, to my grandmother, who only lived for 4 years after 89. And I think it was a trauma I realized I was carrying that I wasn't even aware of. So there was so much one got to learn while writing it. But really, it was, I think, in a short sentence, if I were to sort of sum it up why I wrote, and it was really to resist erasure at some point, which I didn't even know at that point when I started writing it. I didn't know what I would encounter, but eventually it was resisting erasure at so many levels. As a woman, as that young girl. In fact, a friend of mine called me up after the book came out, and she's like, how do you feel as a grown-up? So it was really like time stops at some point in that particular moment, and you regress as into a 9-year-old over and over again in some moments. I mean, I'm privileged enough to have gone into therapy, etc. Something happens at home and I'm back to where I was in 89. All the work comes undone. And of course, I mean, then you recover, but it's sort of that moment doesn't leave you. And those experiences weren't there at all in all the literature that's been coming out from Kashmir. And yeah.
As a writer, you do a great service by writing a story because it allows people a portal to enter their own stories, their own traumas, their own sort of memories that they've kind of not been able to negotiate with. But what does it do to you as a writer? Because on one hand, you could argue that it's a way to process trauma. On the other hand, you're also, like you said, you were having panic attacks. It's also a way of dredging up perhaps trauma all at once, that too, because I imagine you're writing a book over a year, 2 years, whatever the case might be. That's the world you are choosing to re-enter and make sense of. Any thoughts on that?
I think that was the toughest choice, to continue with it, because after writing 8 chapters, I was actually advised not to think about that time. I was put on medication, but then for about 6 months, I didn't write a word. And I would try to write, and I just wasn't getting to where I wanted to. And I couldn't fully recover those memories. I would talk to people whose stories I was writing about. And then one day I just woke up and just stopped taking medication. And I was like, I am not going to do this. I'm just going to try it, give it one last try. If it doesn't work, then I'll stop writing. It's an extremely difficult choice to make. I think writing about that time, and that's why one sees that why women sort of, or they have been told that they can't deal with complex situations and they can't hold contradictory, thoughts in their heads, and they must only think in one particular direction. That could also be one of the things that one sort of is hesitant. But once you go into it, you're just like a human who sort of will deal with what it throws at you. And yeah, some days become extremely difficult to write about it. And I mean, I've had this question come to me often where people ask me, was it cathartic? But to me, it's like, to your previous question that you were asking, that if my experience and my niece's experience, who is now 10, is similar, if our experiences are similar, then has the partition really ended for us in that sense? So,
Ruby, one of the things that we do all have in common in terms of our shared history is movement and migration. I mean, so much of our histories were built on migration. And you are somebody who's also migrated from Pakistan and, to another country. And thereby there's this sort of two-pronged marginalization, in Pakistan, in our sort of very patriarchal societies, as a woman with a strong point of view. And then, of course, as a woman of color, choosing to write about to represent themes that are close to your heart. I wonder if, how these different experiences have informed what you create. And have you found a sort of transnational feminism? And if you make anything of that term at all, in fact?
Yeah, of course. I mean, starting with the first question, growing up in Pakistan and living in a family which is kind of really represent the patriarchal norms, how women are seen. I mean, it starts from your experiences of very when you were little, and how you were treated and how your younger brother is treated, and the stories that you are told about your birth, how it was received when you were born, and how people came to console the family as a fourth daughter, so it's okay, this is how you are growing up, and you learn to put yourself in a secondary position all the time, and not at the forefront, or not you accept this to some extent, but being a human being, it's not possible that you can live like that, and so you try to find ways to express how it is. But I would say that when I was studying, I never used my own personal experiences and not looked for certain materials which I can speak through my thing. But when I lived with my mother for about 11 years, in those years, I kind of felt the connection between the cast-offs of my family members whom I had lost. And I started to build a narrative through that, just because I knew that my mother, who I'm taking care of, will not going to survive. So I will lose the focus and will shatter. So I started to make dolls out of all those things that I had, materials that I had collected. And that was a kind of language, or you can say that you can stop women from going to certain, platforms, but you cannot stop them from making work. And I think that is the resistance. So what I would feel about myself is that I constantly had connection with the world by making work and saying what I was feeling. So it was a kind of silent communication between myself and the rest of the world. And it disconnected when I came to, when we migrated here in 2002 in California from Pakistan. And that was the time that I kind of totally was disconnected, because I was working at a corporate facility from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And it was physical, it was all that kind of stress. So when you don't have the time to think about yourself, and your memories are, which are so precious, you don't have time to think about those. So that, I think, disconnect builds something in me, like you can say that a bitterness, loss, which was not that much when I lost my people, but which was a connection with myself. So when you come after a long day and you cannot make sense of the life that you are living. You feel like you are as you can say that, those bulls who go round and round and extract the seeds, and they have blinders on their eyes, so they cannot see the world, and they, from day to night, they do the job. So this was that kind of experience that I felt. And I feel that when you lose control over your life, or then you get to become physically or mentally sick, and then you disconnect. I remember the time when I couldn't go back to my home, which was in Pakistan, because I took a job which won't let me go anywhere. And that was the first condition to take up the job, that you will not take the time off. So my home was disposed of in my absence. And I could hear only the news that it was filled with water because the thieves stole the sanitary fittings, and because I thought that I would come back and take my things. I did not leave the home in rush, as that in the migrations, in the crisis, people leave. But still, when I couldn't go back, I would dream about my place and my things. And I kind of have this idea, how could the years of memories that are stored in that place, those treasures, that I would never be able to see them again. And when I went after 3-4 years, there was nothing there. There was no house. It was all wilderness, because it was erased. Somebody had bought it, and they demolished it, and they were wilderness grown. And I could not believe that how the chapter is closed. The people who lived there, who loved, and whom I lost, and there's no trace of that. So I started to connect with other people who lost their homes in hurry, and they abandoned their own places unwillingly. And so how would that experience look like? So I brought with me, I had brought with me the family members' clothing and all that, because that was the only precious thing for me, which I would use in my work. I sew them and I cut them. So piece by piece, they all finished. So I ran out of the clothing. So I started to go to thrift stores. And in my Brooklyn neighborhood, when we moved to New York, and so I started to think about the material, like the biographies of people, as if I'm holding them. These are other people's lives. I don't know whether they were immigrants, whether they were native, where they come from, what their life experiences were. But they seem to me, they carry the similar warmth as my own family members' clothing was. And because I desperately wanted to build a connection with the new world where I landed, and I felt that was the only way that I could understand the world. And but I would say that that I would bring those clothes and sew them, cut them, sew them, and dismantle them, and all this process would connect me to the unknown people and their experiences. And there became a time when I lost through mental breakdowns. I couldn't keep up the connection with my own self, but I would still work, and I would just do the work which did not require a lot of problem solving and things. I would just sew them or just cut them and make simple strips. So I had heaps and heaps of material that I was building, but I was not getting to a point where I could make them into real work. And how afraid I was of meeting people. I was scared to death if I had been introduced to somebody and I had to speak something because I had no words. My thoughts were so fragmented. I don't know what to do. I would avoid going socializing, and and there came a point that I couldn't take care of myself. And so many people might have seen me in that situation, but they never told me that how I look like. I still feel that I should go back, and people at that time, other than my husband, who kind of, was the witness and who helped me. But I think these are the connections that we make through our work, and the experience of migration, experience of being a woman in a country. But here I see that when I see, the nature and women, I see a certain similarities, because you can see a centuries of, a lived life or a duration in them, as you see the duration in nature. So I feel that I immediately to the city here, or you can say the women here. I will say just a little thing, that the first time how I connected with the city was that, at the place where I felt that when I heard that, this train is, what did they say, World Trade bound center, World Trade Center bound train going this way. And I looked at people and I saw that, World Trade Center does not exist at that time in 2009. 2009. And I felt like, I looked at them and I realized they have lost their thing as I immediately connected through that experience. So I have a very strange relationship with the world. And I would say that, so that would be my answer to your question. If it's...
That was a wonderful answer, Ruby. Thank you for that. Varunika, you of course, like Ruby, there are so many themes that sort of come up in your work, whether it's socio-political critique, whether it's fault lines. But one thing that has often recurred in your work is, your work existing at the cross-section of history and art. And I was wondering what it is that historical art forms or, recorded history allows you to explore and sort of implores you to explore.
You're right. I think my work dips both into sort of documentary history or more tangible sources of history, as well as art history. While a lot of my work is influenced by the Chilean writer Eduardo Galeano, and he has this really beautiful statement. He says, to understand the present, we have to search for the keys for it in the past. And I think what looking at history does for me is that it allows me to not just bring evidence or present evidence, but also string together certain incidents which can throw sort of more light on our present predicament. But then what visual strategies do we develop? And this is where art history becomes like a very rich resource. Of late, I've done this sort of deep dive, I think I'm still on it, into apocalyptic manuscripts, especially the 16th century manuscript from Bavaria called Osberg Wanderzeichenberg, or the Book of Miraculous Signs, which deals with both miraculous and apocalyptic signs. And what it does for me is that it helps me formulate visual strategies to both articulate political and social upheaval. In other time, I've trained as an art historian, so I think there is a deep love for art history, but there's also like a deep discomfort with by which especially art from the past is verified almost as if it's something very sacrosanct that you cannot mess with it. And I think as artists, we always sort of like to intervene and sort of mess with things. And so what happens is sometimes I end up referencing things, sometimes I end up spoofing, sometimes I end up subverting. I think I often like to think that I'm just like one image away from being excommunicated from the Church of Art History.
That's a wonderful thought. But Anomaa, one of the things that Ruby brought up was material, and I was wondering when you do, again, you're somebody who's written poetry, who's taken pictures, and but perhaps we'll talk about your documentary films at this point in time. And I was, you've written about women who are survivors of conflict, who suffered during conflicts, as well as what women in leadership positions can do. I was wondering, A, how you pick the subject you want to document through cinema, through films, and B, what it is that you set out to do through that process of documentation?
Actually, I started making films when I was 17, about 40 years ago. It's a long time ago. And then I had a lot of things I wanted to do, but then 83 happened. 1983 in Sri Lanka, like the most known conflict between the two communities exploded. I mean, it has been there, but like basically a turning point in the Sri Lankan history. And I was in school. And then the temple, Hindu temple in front of, I come from the majority community, Sinhalese Buddhist community, but I can remember that there was a Hindu temple across the road from my school, and it was burnt down. And the town I came from, it's a southern town, Panadura, that the main street of my birthplace, it got, the one community got erased overnight. All the houses were burned down. So that had an impact, like all the shops that we used to go, where we used to shop, like, everything was burned down if that was like, belonging to a person of the other community. So that had an impact as a child. And when I started making films, I started with Super 8 and I was into fiction, but my academic background is I'm a researcher, I'm a social science. I come from a social science background. And in my research, I came across many cases where that I felt like, as I told you at the very beginning, the women's stories are missing. Because basically one thing in Sri Lanka is it basically people behind the recording devices were men. And on the other hand, when there's a conflict between two ethnic groups and majority community controls certain things, including media and a lot of things. So that is why I felt like women's stories, and especially like minority women's stories, were missing. So I felt like I had to do some kind of documentation. So at a point of my life, I gave up making films, like, to deliver films as films. I was like, into documentation. Whatever that I come across, I'll record. And record using whatever device that I had at that time. Could be a video camera or a SLR camera, a photograph, a video clip, whatever. But on the other hand, because of the controlled nature of our country at that time, you pass many bunkers, go questioned, and the recording devices were not allowed beyond certain points. So then that you don't know how to record it, that you have stories around, and that, then that's when I started writing poetry, because I felt like I should document it in some way. So there was no time sometimes to do long essays, whatever, So then whatever, that visually struck me, that I started writing poetry. So when I look back, that more than the films I finished, what I have done is I have documented. I have documented the, basically, I was displaced also, because I was working in the north and the east, because I'm from the south, with other communities. And I felt like I was not belonging anywhere. This whole feeling of belonging to a place, to a community, to people. Because when I cross the border and go, so I'm from the other community, so people look at you like, that suspicion, whatever, that question marks. And on the other hand, when I cross the border and come back to my own community, that people look at me like, what is she doing there? So I was like, this whole belonging thing was part of me. So I had an urge to document. So I kept documenting. And that came out when that we were kind of commemorating the 25th anniversary, kind of like, 25th year of 1983 in 2007, I planned a documentary, but because of the political pressure, the then government, the pressure, like, they wanted to stop everything. So I couldn't go ahead with the documentary. Then I was so disappointed. And because I have worked for like, nearly 2 years to identify the cases, the research, everything, looking for people within the country, in the diaspora, everywhere, to talk about 83. So I couldn't go ahead with the production. Then I sat at home and very disappointed. And I realized what I have been doing in the past was documenting. So I took out all my photographs and I had a solo exhibition called July Life After 25 Years. Basically, it was in 4 parts. It was my story. My story was an essay, how I came to, like, how I became an adult, how I have spent my adulthood in the conflict. And then there were 2 cases, a man and a woman whom I met in the conflict zones, their stories, and generally the other stories. Though that the conflict was between 2 communities, the Sinhalese and the Tamil, but like, the Muslim community, on the other hand, was also affected. They were chased away. So I was basically working, documenting. So for me, when to answer your question, when I look back, like, I see myself, yes, I have worked as a photographer, had a few solo exhibitions. I had films on the conflict, on women, a lot of things. But basically, I think what I have done is, in a country where there's no archive, documented as much as possible. I may not be able to finish any of this work, but like, I wanted to keep up whatever I could capture and keep it for the future generations. And that's what I have been doing as a filmmaker mainly, and a photographer. Documentalist, I would say.
That's a nice one. Leesa, of course, there's a lot of work. Again, you're somebody who works across mediums, and there's a lot of things that you have tried to examine through your work. But I wanted to, because you brought up birangunas as well. If their story it's not to say it hasn't been told. It has been told, but it's also been appropriated. It's also been obfuscated. And I was wondering what brought you to the story, and what is it that what was your sort of impetus? What is it that you wanted to do with those stories and the medium that you chose to tell those stories? But perhaps you could, I'm sure most people who are tuned in do know who birangunas are, perhaps a sentence introducing them and who we call birangunas, and then about your work on them, and, the fact that there's this, we were talking to Farah about it, but the sort of trauma that, that their stories bring up, and how can work mediate that trauma.
Thank you. I really relate to Anomaa, because my impetus was also to document it. I learned about the Biranguna women first from my father when I was 17 years old. My father was a freedom fighter, and we grew up in an environment where we couldn't talk about our liberation war, after the assassination of the founding leader of our country, Bangladesh. So it was quite hush-hush. The way our history book, there's nothing written in our history book in terms of perpetrators, came and killed so many people. Who those perpetrators were, where they came from, when this information was not written. So we used to learn about our liberation war from people like my father, who was a freedom fighter. So he told me, he told me and my brothers, he told me about witnessing hundreds of raped women and girls standing back to back on a convoy of trucks, like sacrificial animals. This image never left me. We know that a systematic campaign of genocide and rape of 200 to 400,000 women and girls were carried out by the Pakistani army and their local collaborators. This conflict remains one of the first recorded cases of rape used as a weapon of war in the 20th century. So I wanted to meet these women. I mean, where are these women? There's, if you think about the number, but then you can't find them around you. So who are they? I mean, in Bengali, biranguna means brave woman. And this was the honorific granted to the victims and survivors of mass rape by the interim government of Bangladesh only 6 days after the war ended. This is very significant because despite the stigma of mass rape, their sufferings, their plight was recognized by Bangladesh, a Muslim, majority country, which is still globally unprecedented. But in reality, these women were hidden and forgotten for decades by a society in which rape is considered to be a source of shame for the victims. And we know that often perpetrators not even included in the conversation. So I wanted to meet them. And in almost 2 decades ago, I went to a small town in Bangladesh, 5 hours away from capital city Dhaka, with a friend to meet 21 biranguna women at a women's center named Uttoran Mohila Sangsa. And that was the first time I met them in person. I did not have any plan to create, even the theatrical piece that we developed later at that time. But with their permission, I still went to see them with a small camera crew to record their accounts. We asked them, and they were they wanted to tell us what happened to them. So we took their accounts, and why I did that, maybe because I was looking for them without even consciously realizing it since I was 17. And I thought there must be many like me who want to know them. So I wanted to know these women on their own terms, beyond labels and statistics. But they, as I said, they were nowhere to be found. After 1975, we had 2 or 3 versions of the history of the country's bloody birth. And I was of the first generation of a newborn nation that saw 2 bloody military coups. The history books of my age used to read something like, in 97, we fought against the perpetrators. We were not allowed to know who those perpetrators were. Many people suffered ridicule, harassment, and even killed for being freedom fighters. They were representative of an ideal which had a vast popular resonance, but which the authorities wanted to stamp out. So we can only imagine what the biranguna women had to go through. After August 15, they were thrown out of women's rehabilitation centers overnight across Bangladesh. The centers were then locked up and documents were destroyed to erase the evidence of their existence. And as far as the world is concerned, 71 is a forgotten genocide of the 20th century. So the plight of those, survivors stood little chance to be acknowledged. But since meeting the survivors, I was holding on to their accounts. And then after a year or so, I heard the inevitable that one of the women I interviewed, I met, died. And it shook me it shook me so profusely. And I kept on watching the video I recorded. I did not want to forget her name. Her name was Bahatun. I realized when a Birangana woman dies, her story dies with her. That forced me to return to Bangladesh in 2013 with our theatre company, Kamala Collective, to work on a research and development of the theatrical piece Birangana Women of War, based on their stories. And after watching their own stories on stage, one of them, Raju Baladi, said, "Go and tell the world." And that is how the play was created. And when I realized that the play, once the tour is done, it will be gone. I was not a filmmaker. I am a theater practitioner. But then I realized that to document those stories, I have to make a film. And that's how the journey of Rising Silence, the documentary film, I began. Yeah.
So I think we could move to audience questions now. I, of course, had many questions, but as part of something that someone from the audience has asked, which is, do you see your work as filling a gap or asking a new question? I did want to tack on a question I had to that, which is about mediums. The topic of conversation is art and resistance. And I was wondering how your chosen medium, whether you could think of medium as the broad category of theater, poetry, cinema, sculpture, art, writing, or you could also think of the medium you use in, like Ruby was talking about, what is it that's going into making her sculptures, and what is it that those mediums enable you to do over and above what exists in the world as documented fact or documented history? What is it that your medium allows you to fill as a gap? Perhaps we could start with you, Ruby.
Sure, thank you. This is a very important question, and it directly relates to my art practice. I think there is a sort of rebellion in oneself that you do not like to be told what to do, what to select, what to follow. So when there are certain established norms already there, or certain materials, there is a, authority of certain materials, or, they are accepted, or so you find your own way because your experiences are different. Your life has been different. Your story is different. So how can you just fit into that mold and do whatever is being done before you, or like other than your self, other contemporaries are doing? So you try to look for certain materials that directly relates to your content, or you have the confidence that they can hold your content. So whether it's perishable, whether they are have no significance, but they are meaningful to you and to your practice. So, for example, I would say that when I talked about the memories which were fading away, and I wanted to keep them. So I looked for the materials like fallen twigs, because they are of the fragmentary nature as the memory is. So I would collect them and make the image that I had in my mind of my memory. So I was obsessed with that material. It was, I would say that I was away from the pressures of saving it, selling it, or keeping it. Because it was not meant to be like that. It was just to communicate or to find a way to say what I wanted to, what I was feeling and I wanted to convey through the materials. Maybe I wanted to see myself rather than competing with someone, or rather than, because there is a hierarchy of materials, accepted materials. So it's my choice that I choose the closest to myself material, which we all relate to. This is material on our bodies, and this is material on our bodies who we have lost. You can say that. But I think that more than that, I would say that material sometimes play such a big role, and you don't have to worry about that. Is it going to survive or not? I mean, I would say that I was inspired by, as a Punjabi literature student in Pakistan, I was inspired by the male Sufi poets who adopted a female voice because they think that was the most humble, or because women were considered inferior in the society, so adapted that voice. I could relate to that. I looked for the materials which were to be thrown away, which people used to, it could be rags that are used to clean the auto bodies, or, stuff like that. But that had a meaning for me because they have lived the life. They come to me, and, they are histories of people whom their bodies touched with that material. So I think that without all these pressures, you are just drawn to, you make your own way. But whatever you identify with, without any, so I also felt that I was given certain materials which I did not select because a woman in Canada, when I was visiting, she gave me a bag full of cut pieces because she was working. She was she would alter the bridal clothing that would come from India. So those crepes or the cut off pieces were of no use for her when she knew that I was working material. So that was the first time I started looking at the ornamental quality of the women's material. I was not working with such glamorous, beautiful pieces before. So that added another dimension to my work. And I started to see the architecture through that material, how Muslim architecture or the architecture of subcontinent or, in history is the facades are heavily decorated. And there is such a similarity between these two, the embroideries, the gold embroideries that, the ceremonial clothing of women in Pakistan, India, or, places like in South Asia. I felt a connection with that. And it is so interesting that the architecture or the body-like structures that I was building, they came just right to that. So they remind us of a glory of the architecture that once it had, but it's gone. So every scrap of thing, every material that you are using becomes meaningful. Yeah.
Is there anyone else? We're very, very short on time. I'm very sorry about this. But is there anyone else who would like to add to what Ruby was talking about? If yes, please do feel free, irrespective of your turn. And if not, then I'll move on to some other wonderful questions that we have. Anyone? Okay, well, you can always join in later. But The two sort of related questions that have come up. One is, to what extent do you think the subversive interpretation of art shapes the imagination of a movement in the post-movement period? I link this question to depictions of nationalist prints of motherland and fatherland in self-determination movements. And the other one is most war memoirs written by men also engage with the crucial category of nation. How do women's memoirs, I suppose it could also extend to women's documentation and women's art, negotiate the notion of nation? I'm sure there are differences. Again, I'm not going to put it to any one of you, but if any one of you wants to take that question, these two questions, I think that would be great. Perhaps Varunika, I'm just suggesting, or Anomaa, one of you could tackle this. Would you like to give this a shot, Varunika? I think you're muted.
Wait, yeah, I think, can you hear me? Yeah, I think they're two really sort of different questions, and I think Anomaa would be sort of, Anomaa and perhaps even Farah would be better able to talk about women's memoirs and sort of their experience of nationhood. I personally would think, given my experience, I've not had the same kind of experiences as the other panelists have, but yes, I would think the way women imagine a nation is very, very different from the way men would imagine a nation.
Anything that you'd like to add, Anomaa? Anyone else? Okay, I'm going to go on to, and perhaps Farah can take this question. Again, two linked questions. One is that can one write about or make art about conflict, trauma, exile without first-hand experience? Is there something missing in observer first accounts? And the other one is experiencing political or geopolitical conflict is a collective experience more often than not. What are the specific challenges you face as artists in capturing and presenting collective trauma versus individual trauma? Farah, in your case, for instance, your book is about your own experiences as an adolescent, but so much of it is about the experiences of others around you. But I feel like, so this second part of the question is directed towards you, Farah, but I also feel like perhaps, Leesa, you could come in on this, this idea of course, it's part of your history, but it's also presenting the trauma of other people. Farah, would you like to start?
Sure. I think when you grow up in conflict zones, the first thing is, would your account be even considered to be truthful? Would it even consider, what is the veracity of whatever you're saying? Is it true? Because everything has been written. So as a woman, so you thinking back, like I said, there are 9 chapters about me, but there are 14 about other women. And what was the need to really do that? So you do, one is experiencing it individually, and then to show the magnitude of what happened collectively and showing the unique experiences even within the collective. So one is that. I think the second part is to really give numbers to your experiences, it's almost to show the magnitude when you're growing up in such in such situations, to show the significance of what you've gone through. I think because every experience that shapes you in conflicts, in wars, you just you feel your voice, you feel suppressed at some level, and probably by numbers, through sheer numbers, through sheer experiences, you want to amplify your own voice, and by showing the collective. I think for me, it was that. Another was, I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Yeah, we'll just go to Leesa after this. Yeah.
No, but thank you, Farah. But what I was thinking when I was spending time with these women, one thing really struck me was how they looked out for fellow survivors to heal, which I thought unique to only Bangladesh survivors, but meeting other survivors across the globe, when I met the survivors from 15 countries, at the Global Survivors Network, I found the same thing. And once I asked a survivor from Bangladesh and a survivor from South Sudan that how they would know if a person was also a survivor of mass rape. How do you know that? Interestingly, they both, gave me almost the same answer. They said something would give away through their mannerisms, reaction to, sudden sound and light, and the way they carry themselves. And then they added, you wouldn't know, and they added, you wouldn't know, but we would know. And this is really very interesting when we were thinking, because countries like ours, they never had any kind of counseling, any kind of support from society or community. So what they used to do is they would extend their support, their years to another survivor. And that's how they healed. And that is so amazing. And what that shows, that actually shows that how little safe space they have to deal with their trauma. And that's and through music as well. Music plays a huge role, and of course prayers to heal. So I saw that. And another thing I would like to share, that these triggers, they never go away. They can. What they do is they kind of manage, and they kind of develop a way of life that they can they can function, but it's still there. I mean, when one of the survivors, her name is Jhorna Boshu, she had to leave Bangladesh. She had to leave Bangladesh, move to India, because she would see her torturers in random places. She actually didn't see them, but she thought she would, and she's like, I can't live here. So this is the trauma haunts them and their families all their lives, and what we can do is we can give them a caring, kind, and safe space, and listen to them and acknowledge them. It is so vital to acknowledge what survivors are saying.
I don't know if I'm allowed to ask another question, but I will, since no one's interrupting me, our time is technically up, but I'll go ahead and ask it. And I'm going to club 3 questions that have come in. All 3 of these questions actually relate to how art is received and what one can do about that. One simply asks what can be done to make more and more people engage with art. Another is a little bit more complex, and it kind of talks about, that if we are as women talking a lot about the traumas women go through, men are an essential part of the conversation. What can we do? What strategies can we employ to engage viewers, specifically the other gender, emotionally and intellectually, encouraging them to reflect on their own beliefs and biases? And the third one is a very, very long question. I'm going to try and abbreviate it. But essentially, what it's talking about is, it's talking about how you can build community and collective action on the back of art. So what it's asking is, I fear self-expression alone reduces our experiences to individual stories, easier to consume, but also easy to walk away from. I agree that making work is resistance, but what networks of community can be imagined today? So all of these questions essentially are asking about how you negotiate with questions of how your work is received and its impact. And either that broader question or any of these specific questions, if you would like to take, that would be amazing. Again, I don't want to ask anybody in particular, but anyone want to go first? I do want to say I hate reducing, as much as the other person, people to stereotypes. But if this was a panel of men, and I've been put on so many of them, there would be like, every one of you would have wanted to answer every single question. But having said that, is any one of you would you like to start first, or any thoughts on this?
I think I would just like to take on the last question with the slightly longer one. And I think when we think about communities of cares and strategy and what art does, I think sometimes I feel like art is really hopeless. What are you doing? Are you just preaching to the choir? Are you just speaking to people who already agree with you? But then again, conversations such as this that we're having today, it sort of, helps us sort of set into place future conversations. And I know that this conversation perhaps will not end here and might end up having sort of parallel conversations later with all of you or with you individually. And I think that is one way that we move forward. And maybe individually we cannot affect change, but collectively I think we can.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's a wonderful thought. Anyone else would like to take this question? I mean, all of you are essentially, so much of your work does engage with wanting change, wanting things to not, the status quo to be disrupted. So I was wondering if you'd like to, Anomaa, you, Ruby.
Yeah,
anyone?
I would like to. Yeah, I would like to actually share what I do right now, because it is about engagement of, across borders. It could be gender, it could be other, but what I try to do is, one of my chosen mediums is film. So I try to use film to get engaged, going beyond certain art circles to reach general public kind of. So I use short films because the length is short to get communities engaged. So I make short films on certain issues with young people, women. So we go and have community screenings, get them engaged on especially issue-based things. And then on the other hand, use the medium because you asked the question of medium previously also, use the medium of film for lobbying purposes, for changing laws, a lot of things. Because, for example, in Sri Lanka, that I have done it with the Domestic Violence Act, lobbying with the judiciary for fast-track courts especially for rape victims. I have done a film called Yet Another 5, that is from individual to collective, you could say, documenting 5 cases of rape victims and taking it to why we need, because in Sri Lanka, all these cases, the victims suffer not years, but decades sometimes, that. So that why that we need a fast track court system, the legal system, kind of that. And right now in South Asia, I think India, now that you have decriminalized the LGBTIQ issues, so across this, I have used this medium, the chosen medium, for lobbying and to engage people, general public kind of, doing community screenings across the country. That's what I do using the medium, because you are talking about engagement and reaching out.
Well, that's 2 very thoughtful and hopeful interventions. If no one has any other closing remarks, I think I am being called upon to end the session. I mean, it's been so wonderful listening to all of you. I'm not even exaggerating. I would forget the questions I had to ask with everything all of you were saying, and I wish I had more time. But like Varunika said, perhaps this conversation will continue in another way, on another platform amongst all of us and the broader audience that's been here. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for listening to us. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Asia Society. And with that, I will end the session. Once again, it's been lovely.